Kia ora tātou, no mai haere mai, and thank you for joining us today for this special report, Inside the Hunger Crisis in the Horn of Africa. My name is Amy Richardson. I am Save the Children New Zealand's Communication Director, and I'll be facilitating tonight's webinar. I'd like to start with a special welcome to our guests, the University of Otago's Professor Stephen Knowles and Save the Children New Zealand's Director of International Programs, Rachel Waugh. Professor Stephen Knowles, his work on economic growth and development includes analysing the effects of gender inequalities in education and health on economic growth and the relationship between social capital and economic performance, the effects of government intervention on economic performance, and the relationship between income inequality and economic growth. Quite a lot to cover. Rachel joined Save the Children in late 2021 after more than a decade working in international development, including as head of international community development projects for Australia's Salvation Army. In that role, she oversaw some 25 plus community development projects across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Rachel specialises in strategic alignment, project quality and compliance alongside stakeholder and government engagement. She holds a Master's of International Social Development from the University of New South Wales and has completed leading sector training programs. And a special ngā mihi and thank you to you all for joining us. We have friends here from all around Aotearoa and we're extremely pleased that you've made it here with us today. So we're going to get started with a bit of context to what we're talking about. But if you just pop into the chat your location, that would be great. And also any questions that come along the way, you're welcome to pop them into the chat or into the QA section at the bottom of your screen as well. So in Somalia at the moment, there is no water, no food, and no time to wait. Children in Somalia are living through the worst drought in at least 40 years. With no water, livestock are dying and families are going hungry. Now the war in Ukraine is making things worse as Somalia imports most of its wheat from Europe. So here's a short video that we're about to play to hear a bit more.
markuu dabal meesha laga laasto biyaha quraan bay meesha dhulku qallayl bahaa eegil waxa ka mudaq jireen oo jaaci jireen
أول نطلع وصلنا جري هذا بيز قردال عناية.
أنا يقول فلان هاي سنة بيا يقول فلان أنا ولا شيء هو يدا وطلعنا وقاعد شومين أنا واحد شعله إنه بيا يقول فلان أنت يقول فلان وطشين.
Thank you so much, Kat, behind the scenes. That gives us a bit of context for why we are here talking about this really important issue today. So for months, the UN has been warning that famine is imminent in parts of the Horn of Africa before the year is out. Across Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, 22 million people are at risk of starvation after experiencing the worst drought since the 1980s. If malnutrition and death rates get high enough, the UN will declare that a famine is occurring, with the risk especially high in Somalia. So I'm going to turn to you, Stephen, and ask, why are we still talking about famine in this part of the world? If you could provide us with some insights, that would be fantastic. Thanks, Stephen.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you, Amy, for the introduction. So I think Kat's going to bring up some slides and then I'll start talking about them. So there's quite a lot on this slide. So just to talk you through it one bit at a time. And I guess the first question is, when we talk about the Horn of Africa, where exactly are we talking about? And there's different definitions out there, but most people, when they talk about the Horn of Africa, are thinking of Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, and Djibouti. And Ethiopia and Somalia are the biggest two countries out of those four, both in terms of area and population. People sometimes talk about the greater Horn of Africa, which also includes Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya. I'm going to be talking mainly about Ethiopia and Somalia. And I guess to motivate what I want to talk about, we're probably all aware that back in 1983 to 1985, there was a famine in Ethiopia where 1.2 million people ended up dying. That's the worst famine that we've had. There hasn't been a worse one since. And in response to that famine in Ethiopia, Bob Geldof organised the Live Aid concert in 1985, where there were concerts held both in Wembley and London, and there was also a concert in Philadelphia, and they were sort of held kind of simultaneously. And so Geldof organised the Live Aid concert, but a few months before that, he'd also organised a group of musicians going by the name Band Aid to record the song Do They Know It's Christmas, to raise money for famine victims as well. So I guess the title of this talk, Famine in the Horn of Africa, again, was Live Aid only a Band-Aid, is to get at the idea that, all this money that was raised back then, did it actually do any good if we've got famine happening in Africa again? And I guess the main point that I want to make is that, we are very likely going to have a famine occur in the Horn of Africa again. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been some significant progress made in terms of people's lives, particularly in Ethiopia, since Live Aid was held back in the 1980s. And I've just listed there some of the famines that have occurred in Ethiopia, well, the famines that have occurred in Ethiopia and Somalia. So we've got one in Ethiopia and two in Somalia. But if you're wondering how bad things need to get before a famine is actually declared by the United Nations, I've got the criteria listed there. So you need to have 20% of households in an area facing extreme food shortages, more than 30% of children suffering from extreme malnutrition, and at least 2 in 10,000 people die from starvation, disease, and or malnutrition every day. So that's a fairly high bar that has been set. And things are pretty bad already, but they're not quite bad enough to be deemed as a famine. But unfortunately, it's likely that that will happen. So Kat, if we could have the next slide. So some questions this impending famine raises, at least for me, what are the causes of the current crisis? Why is it that famine's occurring again? But another question this raises for me is life in these countries getting worse over time? And it's perhaps easy to think that maybe it is if famines keep occurring. But if that's the case, if famine is something that happens again and again and again, are these countries somehow beyond help, and will things ever get better? So those are the questions that I want to talk about. And if we could have the next slide, Kat, what I want to talk about first is, what are the causes of this looming famine in the Horn of Africa? And there's basically 4 of them. Firstly, drought for the last 4 years. And this is the worst drought that has occurred in this region since the drought that we had in the 1980s that caused that famine in Ethiopia. And this drought has no doubt been made worse by climate change. And I guess a point I want to emphasize is that climate change is something that the people of the Horn of Africa are not responsible for. Their greenhouse gas emissions are minuscule compared to the developed countries in the world. Also, this has already been mentioned, so I won't dwell on this, but we've got increasing food prices due in part to the war in Ukraine. That should be due in large part, actually, to the war in Ukraine. And a lot of grain has historically been imported from the Ukraine, and that's particularly true in the case of Somalia. And again, this is something that is completely outside of the control of the people of Africa. Putin began the war in the Ukraine. It's got nothing to do with people in the Horn of Africa. And COVID-19 has contributed to this as well. And we know that in many parts of Africa, as in other parts of the world, that COVID-19 meant that there were families who were having to eat less and their work hours were getting shortened as a result of COVID and the economic response in many countries to that. So COVID has contributed to this problem as well. And COVID is something that started in China. It didn't begin in the Horn of Africa. So those first three reasons are all things that are external. This is not the fault of the people living in these countries at all. Conflict, and I mean by this internal conflict, has also contributed to the problem as well. And there's civil wars happening currently in Somalia and in Ethiopia, and this is making the problem worse. So of the four things I've got listed there, the only one that's an internal factor is conflict. But I think it's really important to emphasize that the people that are going to end up starving as a result of this are not those that wanted the conflict to happen in the first place. So for most of the rest of what I'm going to talk about, I want to focus on some indicators of economic and social progress that have been happening, particularly in Ethiopia, over the last 40 years or so. So Kat, if you could jump to the next slide, would be great. So that's the Ethiopian flag that we've got there. And when we want to look at what's happening in different countries, the sorts of things that we might look at are measures of health indicators like life expectancy and infant mortality, measures of education, and looking at what's happening to people's incomes and the rate of poverty. And on this slide, I've got some information on life expectancy in Ethiopia, and we can see that it's been going up pretty consistently over time. And back in 1980, life expectancy in Ethiopia was 44 years. In 2020, it was 67 years. That's a 23-year improvement in only 40 years. And so that's a pretty impressive improvement. If we look at what's happening to infant mortality, and infant mortality rates are expressed as numbers per thousand. So back in the early 1980s, the infant mortality rate was about 140 people per thousand, and that's now dropped to 35 people per thousand. So that's a really impressive improvement as well. And a large part of this improvement in life expectancy is due to the fact that children are more likely to live through the first few years of their life. So that's an incredibly impressive improvement. Kat, do you want to bring up the next slide for me? And that's going to show data on what's been happening in terms of primary schooling and also income per capita. And I'll say something about what's happening to poverty as well. So if we look at what was happening back in the early 1980s, less than 20% of children of primary school age actually completed primary school. And we can see that the numbers stayed pretty low until around about the turn of the millennium when they started to increase. And we've now got almost 70% of children of primary school age who are actually completing primary school. So that's a really significant improvement. If we look at what's happening to income per capita in Ethiopia, so we can see that back in the early 80s, income per capita was about $300. And by 2019, this had increased to just over $800. Now, these are United States dollars. And we can see that most of that increase has occurred in the last 20 years or so. Now, it's important to emphasize Ethiopia is still a poor country. In fact, it's the 100, in terms of the rankings, there's 221 countries that we have the data for, and Ethiopia comes in at 195th, so it's still pretty poor. In terms of how much income people in Ethiopia have compared to what we enjoy in New Zealand, so your typical New Zealander can afford to buy about 18 times the amount of stuff as someone can in Ethiopia. So incomes are still really low, but there have been significant increases over time. Where Ethiopia has done really well, I think, is reducing the number of people that are living below the poverty line. Now, we don't have data for this every year. The data are pretty sporadic. But we know that in 1995, 65% of the population in Ethiopia was living below the poverty line. And to give you an idea of where that poverty line is set, in terms of New Zealand dollars today, that would be about the equivalent of 3 New Zealand dollars a day. So imagine trying to survive on only $3. So that's what 65% of the population had to do back in 1995 in Ethiopia. By 2015, there was only 27% of the population that were below the poverty line. And clearly that's still far too many, but it's a very significant reduction. And in fact, Ethiopia was one of the few countries in sub-Saharan Africa that managed to achieve the Millennium Development Goal of halving the number of people below the poverty line. So a question this raises perhaps is, well, how has Ethiopia managed to have these reductions in poverty? And Kat, if we could just jump to the next slide, thanks, that would be great. So this reduction in poverty is largely due to the economic growth that's occurred in Ethiopia. That is and we saw data on the previous slide on those increases in income per capita. And I don't want to bore you with too many details about how Ethiopia has managed to get the economy growing, but just to make a few points really quickly. So there's been significantly increased investment in Ethiopia, and with a significant chunk of this money coming from overseas. And a lot of this investment has been in infrastructure and in manufacturing. And the really big infrastructure project in Ethiopia is the dam on the Blue Nile River. And you can see a picture of that on the slide there. This is going to be the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa. And that dam it's been many years in the building, but they started to fill the dam earlier this year. And once it's full, it will be able to supply not only Ethiopia's electricity needs, but some of that electricity will be able to be exported to neighbouring countries as well. Some major clothing brands now are manufactured in Ethiopia as well, and that's just showing some of the foreign investment that takes place. And H&M would be an example of clothing that's manufactured in Ethiopia. And I've just got a photo there of some women in a clothing factory at sewing machines making some garments. I don't know which company they were particularly working for though. And there's also been significant investment in health and education. Things in Ethiopia have improved over time. All of the foreign aid that's been put into that country, it has actually achieved something. That doesn't mean that life is rosy all the time, but it just means that things have improved. If we now turn to look at what's happening in Somalia, and unfortunately things are not looking as good in Somalia. That's the Somali flag there. So we can see that Somalia's life expectancy has improved a bit over time, but Somalia, although life expectancy has improved there, and that's been accompanied by some reductions in the infant mortality rate that you can see on the slide there too. Somalia still actually has the 5th lowest life expectancy of any country in the world. But having said that, things are on the improve. The most worrying statistic, I guess, for Somalia is, we just have one data point telling us what's happening to poverty in Somalia, and it's not good. So in 2017, there was 69% of the population living below the poverty line, and income per capita was only $445 US in 2020. So that's about half of what Ethiopia's was. And why is Somalia not seeing the gains that Ethiopia has? Well, it might have something to do with the fact that there's been civil war raging there basically for the last 3 decades, and there really is no effective government in Somalia. So I guess just to conclude, the point I want to make is that there is a famine coming. The people that are going to be affected by this in the Horn of Africa, and there'll be many of them, they need help. They need help from the international community. They need our help in giving to organisations like Save the Children. But this doesn't mean that living in dire poverty has to be something that continues. We've seen from the example of Ethiopia over time that poverty rates have fallen. But there is a serious crisis coming, and we need to respond to that. So thank you for listening, and I hope you've found something useful there in what I've said.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And we'll come to some questions shortly, but I'd love to hear from you, Rachel. Stephen's identified some of the trends over the past several decades. What are your observations on these trends?
Yeah, and thank you for the presentation, Stephen. That was actually really helpful for me to listen to as well. I think from my experience going through the Horn of Africa and through East Africa over the last decade or so, what my impression of that area is of a population of deeply resilient people. I've had the privilege to be able to work on agriculture projects, water, sanitation projects, where I worked with some excellent people and saw economic empowerment. I saw poverty levels reduce through interventions in different projects across the years. And the one big takeaway that I had more recently over the last couple of years, and again, I was reminded of it when I was in South Africa recently, talking to country directors from Ethiopia and Somalia, Rwanda, Burundi, Kenya, places like this. They're all saying to me, the rains don't come anymore, or the short rains don't come, the long rains don't come. And so they're seeing these changes in environment that are leading to exactly what you're saying, Stephen. But I would highly agree with you that the overall trend is of a population of a resilient community that is growing, but they are under extreme stress from the environment at the moment. And that is where we're finding ourselves today.
So Rachel, what is the impact of climate change?
Well, look, I think even from my experience, and I think everyone can probably agree that day to day we experience climate change here in New Zealand. In my homeland of Australia, they're currently flooded. It is the wettest year on record for Australia. And so we are experiencing that level of climate change day to day ourselves, let alone what's happening across the globe. And what we see worldwide is that a third of the world's children are now living in a situation where they have a dual impact of both poverty and a high climate risk combining together. That was one of the findings out of a report that was released today by Save the Children that's called Generation Hope, 2.4 billion reasons to end the global climate and inequality crisis. And I found that stat in itself was highly disturbing. If we pivot back to specifically the Horn of Africa, in South Sudan, 87% of children are sitting in that dual space of poverty and climate. In Ethiopia, 36 million children are in that space. So I think it's pretty undeniable that climate change is a big driving factor to what we're seeing.
And we heard from some of the children themselves experiencing that. And I think the report that you mentioned was also informed by thousands of children through a series of child hearings around the globe to hear from direct experience what it's like to be living in this climate crisis. Stephen, one of the other issues that you mentioned was COVID and the impact of COVID. Could you go into a little bit more detail about, just how much COVID has impacted on economic growth in that area and perhaps, the kind of the flow-on effects from that?
Sure. So I think in most countries around the world, and the countries we're talking about will be no exception, economies shrank in 2020 as a result of COVID. And most of them grew in 2021 by about the amount they shrank in 2020. So that's really at least 2 years of lost progress. And when you've got people that are living just above the poverty line, a small drop in average incomes can bump a whole lot of people back below the poverty line, and that's what will have happened back in 2020. And when we've got the Sustainable Development Goals that the member nations of the UN all agreed to back around 2015, And the sort of headline sustainable development goal is to eradicate poverty and to eradicate extreme hunger by 2030. And we just couldn't afford to lose 2 years if that was to ever be achieved. It was probably going to be really difficult to achieve anyway, but COVID having come along just makes that task even more difficult.
Thanks, Stephen. Now it's your turn, everyone. So feel free to put your questions into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll get those answered for you. But for the moment, we're going to hear from one of our humanitarian leads who is working on the ground at the moment. She has put together a location vlog for us from Somalia to talk about what Save the Children is doing right now to help. Kat, could you play that video for us, please?
Hi, I'm here in Uskure, which is a village about 150 kilometers outside of Garowe in Puntland, Somalia. And what you see here behind me is a new settlement of people who have basically lost everything. These are pastoralist families who have been hit by a drought that has been going on for 4 consecutive seasons. You can really see it all around you. There's no leaves on the trees, so there's nothing to eat for the livestock that these pastoralists normally herd. Many families told us that they used to have livestock herds of like 300 goats and sheep, but they're left with like 15 or 30 out of them because all of the other ones have died. Our doctors told us that in a village of 350, on average, 7 children every week are being found severely malnourished and need referral to the closest hospital.
I think, unfortunately, we may have had a little bit of a technical glitch there. Gabriella's location blog actually brings us into one of we are going to be launching our Christmas appeal later on in the next week or so, which you wonderful supporters will no doubt be hearing from us about. And it is looking at raising funds to scale up the response in these health centres and responding to the growing numbers of acute malnutrition. We've got a question here. It's a little bit of a curly one, but I think that you'll manage it there, Rachel. So I'm going to put it to you. Is there sufficient international support for the hunger crisis in the Horn of Africa, given that attention is being captured by Ukraine and various domestic, political and climate crises? What's your feeling on that?
That is a curly question, but I think that the easy answer, the most honest answer is no, there's not enough support. I think that the Ukraine crisis and the Ukraine war very rightly got attention that it needed, and it still needs to have attention because that situation has not been resolved, and there will be long-ranging effects for the people of Ukraine, especially the refugee populations in bordering countries. However, I do think it has overshadowed somewhat the needs of the people in the Horn of Africa, which is why it's great that there are people like Stephen who are doing the research and have the data to be able to highlight some of these issues. I would say there is definitely more attention needed for this issue.
I think that that's the case even across our own media in this part of the world, that often the Horn of Africa doesn't get the attention that it deserves in terms of exposure and highlighting some of these issues. And that's why it's fantastic to have people like you, Stephen and Rachel, talking to us and educating us a bit more about what is actually the current situation there. And I think that we're all learning immensely from it. So thank you very much. We've got a question here around, in parts of Africa, I think there have been big conservation efforts, replanting bush. Is that an area that you could see the international community could support? Rachel, have you got a response to that?
Yeah, sure. There actually are some really innovative tree planting, bush replanting programs out there by a number of NGOs that have made quite a significant difference. I remember watching a clip about one in Kenya where they're actually using drones to plant seeds. So the level of innovation going into the African continent, especially through East Africa, is quite amazing. Unfortunately, when you have water shortages, that's still a problem. So we're still seeing that the water shortages and the changes in rainfall due to climate change is having an impact even on those kind of projects. But absolutely, yes, there does need to be a multi-dimensional response of both humanitarian assistance, that immediate emergency response, but also those longer term kind of initiatives to be able to make our communities more resilient in the future as well.
And have immunisation programs been a help for children? Do either of you have anything to say about
I guess
that?
a very general comment on that. So there's a great book that came out earlier this year by Stephen Johnson called Extra Life, and it sort of tells the story of how life expectancies around the world have gone up pretty much everywhere over the last 100 years. And he talks about the things that have contributed to that, and immunizations is one of the key things that he points to. So yeah, I mean, there's just so many things we can immunize children against now that would have killed them in years gone past. Rachel would know more than I do about what's happening on the ground in terms of immunizations, but I think the big fear at the moment is there's been such a focus on COVID that people have not been able to get the other immunizations that they used to get before COVID came along.
Yes, Stephen, I would tend to agree with that. I think there has been and the data is showing that there is a decline in some of the immunization rates because of COVID. It's definitely been a huge impact. Save the Children are focusing on things like cholera and making sure that cholera does not spread within camps and as people are moving around within this particular response. But there's definitely more to be done from the global community on immunizations as a whole. I do see a question that is quite related to that in the chat, though, about what Save the Children is doing as part of the response. And I think that's a really fair question to ask. Just as a brief overview, Save the Children is focusing on 6 different thematic areas, water and sanitation being one of them, as well as health, nutrition, cash transfers for people in emergency situations, education, and a big one being child protection. There are quite a number of unexpected issues that come across as a result of these kind of situations, these emergency situations, and child protection being one of the big ones. Yeah, which is quite unfortunate, but something that is being addressed.
We've had a question come in. How do you ensure the protection of children when they are on the move and so vulnerable? This was a question that I remember we also had during our Ukraine webinar, and I imagine similar kind of approach. Rachel, can you respond to that?
Sure. So the question was how kids are kept safe while they're on the move. Yeah, I think there are lots of different ways that can happen. I think the biggest one that comes to mind is providing safe spaces for children, and that's something that Save the Children is quite committed to doing as part of their response. So setting up safe spaces for kids to be able to play, to be able to get mental health support, and to be able to feel like children and feel somewhat more secure when their world is being tipped over is probably the biggest one.
The conflict that you mentioned, Stephen, in Somalia, how does conflict make it or impact on the ability to provide humanitarian support?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, and it'll be interesting to hear what Rachel has to say about how that works on the ground. But Somalia is one of the most violent countries in the world, and yeah, that must make it really difficult for aid agencies to get support to people in the areas where that's the problem is at its biggest. And I have been reading some suggestions too that maybe the government in Ethiopia is not letting food get to people in Tigray, which is where the civil war is occurring. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear what Rachel has to say about that one, but it does make the job of aid agencies more difficult. It doesn't make it impossible, but it would make it harder.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question you got there, Stephen. I think you've got a point. It's the amount of government interaction and their policies does play a big part in access. So being able to work alongside government or with their approval is really important. I do have to say that I take my hat off to a lot of the aid workers, the humanitarian workers that do go out in these emergency responses, because it is a brave move and there are times where it is insecure. Obviously, we train staff so that they are prepared to be able to deal with the context. But it is a very courageous thing for many people to do, to go into those contexts in order to help people.
Just got one final question. So I'm going to put this to you, Stephen. Does the Horn of Africa have resources such as minerals, oils, etc., that other countries need? Cynically, the question asker says, it seems more intervention occurs where donor countries get something in return.
Yeah, look, if we're talking about government to government aid, historically, a lot of aid has been motivated by the interests of the donor wanting to get something back. And that can help explain why countries that are oil rich have got more aid over the years than countries that are perhaps in more need. I'm not aware of these countries having significant deposits of resources that other countries would be wanting to get their hands on. And what the biggest resource that Ethiopia actually has is rivers that it can actually generate hydroelectricity from. So that is a really major resource that Ethiopia has. But that's not the sort of thing that the Western countries would be wanting to get their hands on. Of course, Somalia is sort of strategically located on a coastline where oil tankers taking oil from the Middle East to the rest of the world pass through. So that there might be a strategic interest in having bases in Somalia.
I'm just gonna, I did say that was the last question, but I'm actually I've got a question for you. I've got one for you, Rachel. What can we at home in New Zealand, what could we do to help?
What can you do to help? I believe that the first thing that I would say would be to be informed. make sure that this issue stays in the news, stays in the media in general, and know what's going on. I think that goes a long way into influencing change. I'm sure there are very practical things you can do. One of them is to consider how you are contributing to the climate change discourse and how your actions are affecting climate change as well, and have a strong think about that, as I will continue to do myself as well. They would be my two takeaways on that.
And I'll just add that you can also, from a very practical point of view, give to our appeal that we're launching. And there is a very particular unique link that has just come into the chat, and that is to kickstart our global, our Christmas appeal to upscale the response for children in the Horn of Africa. I'd like to thank you both very, very much. And thank you all for coming and listening. And yeah, I'm going to say thank you, ngā mihi nui, and ka kite anō. Thank you.
Ka kite.